Thanks for being here today. I'm excited to be a part of this series, and we're going to focus today on wild animals, insects, and ecosystems to One Health, and talk a little bit about biodiversity. So for the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'm going to be talking about what is biodiversity. We're going to touch on hurtling down the path of extinction. Why does this matter to all of us? The agriculture plus biodiversity, what are the big three things or big three takeaways that we can take away from this presentation today? And touch on restoring the future. So, what is biodiversity? A lot of times when we think about biodiversity, we think about primarily species diversity, right? We think about all the different types of animals, plants, fungi, bacteria that are out there in the world. But biodiversity is not only species diversity, we also should be thinking about biodiversity in terms of ecosystem diversity, or in other words, the variety of different ecosystems within a region. And we can also think about genetic diversity within species. So what are the genes that perform the building blocks that create species? Even within species, we have diversity, and that really matters in terms of the web of life and ecosystems. We also know that biodiversity is directly related to our health and the health of all the species out there in the world. And I think coming from an agricultural perspective, you all know that better than anybody, right? Biodiversity really feeds this tree of health outcomes. It feeds the tree of ecosystems. When we think about infectious diseases or microbial biodiversity or water quality or air quality, biodiversity all has a role in that. And with humans, we think about nutrition, we think about mental health, we think about biomedical and pharmaceutical discoveries, and we think about traditional medicines. Biodiversity all has a major role in all of these and underpins all of these factors of life for both us as humans and the web of life that's out there in addition. When we also think about biodiversity and we think about ecosystems, we think about ecosystem services. So scientists have divided up ecosystem services into four main service areas: one supporting, another provisioning, a third regulating, and fourth cultural. And we know that biodiversity is a supporting ecosystem service, but biodiversity really touches on almost all of these other ecosystem services as well. So when we think about biodiversity, we think about how it impacts or affects or as a result of, say, soil formation, photosynthesis, water, food, medicine, cleaning air and water, pollination, flood control. All of these ecosystem services really, I believe, have a direct connection to biodiversity. And I like to think about biodiversity as sort of the canary in the coal mine. It's sort of the surrogate for all these other ecosystem services. And what I mean by that is if we're solving for biodiversity, if we're looking at biodiversity and thinking about that in terms of our agricultural systems, and we're doing everything we can to enhance, protect, and conserve biodiversity, then almost by default, we're also maximizing all these other ecosystem services that are here. So biodiversity for me and for many scientists is really the key to enhancing and conserving and providing these types of ecosystem services. So what's happening now? Hurtling down the path to extinction. Well, we know that wildlife populations are in a free fall now as forests are cut to grow food. We see this all over the world happening more and more as agricultural expands into areas that once were forested. We see this happening. The classic example right now is the Amazon forest and the clear cutting of the Amazon to grow more food. We see this all over the world, whether it's in the tropics in Southeast Asia, all the way to Africa, to South America, and even in the United States. We see that either forests or prairies or other ecosystems are being impacted in order to provide land for agriculture and to grow food. In fact, we also know after some recent studies that the world's insects are hurtling down the path of extinction too. E.O. Wilson is an eminent biologist and researcher. And this quote I really like from E.O. Wilson. He says, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And I think we all know, coming from an agricultural background, how important insects are in terms of our food system. We are under what scientists call now in the midst of this sixth great mass extinction. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of writing on this. E.O. Wilson also coined this phrase back in 1984, where he said the one process now going on that will take millions of years to correct is the loss of genetic and species diversity by the destruction of natural habitats. This is the folly our descendants are least likely to forgive us. So we're seeing threats to birds, we're seeing threats to amphibians, to mammals, to insects, and we see this rate accelerating over time. In fact, some scientists have said that the biodiversity crisis is worse than climate change. And you know, climate change is certainly exasperating the biodiversity crisis, but even without climate change, we're still, but the biodiversity crisis would still be here with us. And it's mainly a result of 3 or 4 or 5 different factors. One is land conversion for agriculture, land conversion for mining, land conversion for forestry, and for urban development and transportation systems. And we're fragmenting the landscape when we do that. And that fragmentation of the landscape causes all kinds of impacts to wildlife and biodiversity. We also have the rapid increase of invasive species out there. And those invasive species are taking over habitat that was once habitat for our native flora and fauna. Pollution is a major threat to biodiversity, both pollution of the soil and pollution of our water systems. And we're also obviously seeing impacts to biodiversity because of climate change, where species in some cases can't move or keep up with the changing climate. And we're beginning to see declines in species because of that. And if we think about biodiversity from an ecosystem perspective, we also know that ecosystems are beginning to shift. Some ecosystems will be decreasing in size, others may be increasing, and others may just disappear altogether. In fact, scientists have begun to look at the ways that species will or potentially could move across the landscape. For instance, this is sort of a projected distribution of elk using some different climate scenarios and how elk will have to move because their habitat will be shifting based on climate change. So when we think about this from an agricultural perspective, we think about how each farm or each pasture or each ranch sits within the landscape and the context surrounding them, and what's going to happen to species as they begin moving or migrating across the landscape. We also know that, you know, the losses due to biodiversity, a major chunk of those losses, in fact, have been because of agriculture, because of our need to grow food and feed the population, that we have altered a great deal of landscape. So about 36 to 37% of the loss of biodiversity can be almost directly attributed to agriculture. And there's some indirect effects also beyond that loss as well. And this is expanding, right? By 2030, around 10% of today's biodiversity will be lost. largely due to expanding infrastructure and agriculture. We talked about some of the drivers out there in terms of the loss of agriculture. We talked about pollution, invasive species, climate change, changes in land use and that type of thing. And we're beginning to see, again, from that biodiversity of ecosystems and species and genetic variability, that we're seeing declines in all of those throughout the world. And in fact, the United Nations came out and with a report that said that the livestock sector now is the leading cause of the reduction of biodiversity. And in the US, 260 million acres have been cleared for grazing and feed, which is 3 times the entire national park system. And while we may need that amount of acres to feed the population, I think there are ways that we can think about how the context in which those acres are used for agriculture and how they relate to the surrounding landscape, and also what they do within the farm or within the pasture or within the ranch as well. Obviously very, very current for what we're going through right now. Livestock expansion and biodiversity losses are positively related to global pandemics. And emerging diseases, livestock expansion and biodiversity loss are positively related at global scale. So we need to be thinking about how we design our farms for the future to not only preserve or conserve or enhance biodiversity, but what are we actually doing on the farm itself? So why does this all matter? Well, obviously biodiversity, and many of you know this, is really important for many different reasons. It provides materials such as food, fuels, and fibers. Biodiversity, again, because if we use that as a surrogate for all these other ecosystem services, it helps to regulate climate, waste, and pollution. It supports processes such as water purification and nutrient cycling. And obviously, it provides opportunity and enjoyment for us in terms of both passive and active recreational activities. In fact, within the farm or within the ranch or agricultural biodiversity is extremely important as well. And you all know this probably much better than I do, that, you know, when we have diversity on the farm, it provides a diverse basket of nutritious foods. It reduces the need for external inputs. It enhances soil health. It increases resilience against climate change. It increases pest and disease resistant, and it contributes to global environmental and development goals. And so when we think about biodiversity, we need to be thinking about it and how we actually operate our farms and our ranches, and the biodiversity that is surrounding our farms and ranches. We also know that around 72% of the world's crops are dependent on insects for pollination. And as we had just heard, that, you know, we're losing insects at an accelerating rate. And so this is extremely important. How do we design our farmland to actually, again, conserve, enhance, restore our insect population? It's interesting when we think about livestock and biodiversity, because there's sort of a yin and yang of livestock on the land, depending on the ecological context and the land history, right? Livestock are either one of the most harmful threats to biodiversity, or in many cases, livestock are actually necessary to maintain a high natural value farmland. And if we look at this diagram on the right, we can see that, you know, the different impacts that livestock have on land in terms of pollution, habitat change, climate change, overexploitation, and invasive species, actually in some ways, when we restore the right type of farming practices for livestock, we can actually, for instance, improve nutrient cycling instead of causing nutrient pollution. Or we can control invasive species instead of spreading invasive species. Or we can actually connect the landscape back together instead of fragmenting the landscape. So it really, you know, it helps to think about how livestock affects, what effects livestock have on biodiversity, and how do we take something that might be a negative and turn it into a positive. And a lot of this work is going on throughout the world right now, where we're beginning to look at how we can better manage, in this case, livestock, to not only not impact the land in many of the ways that livestock have, but how can we actually improve the land and regenerate some of the ecosystem processes that are occurring there. So what are I think the big three are in terms of agriculture and biodiversity? Well, I think the first one is what I call the matrix. And the matrix is this. In landscape ecology, we think about the landscape and the different factors on the landscape. We think about the landscape in terms of corridors, how the connections between, in this case, different forest patches. We think about patches, and we think about all the areas in between those patches and corridors, which we call the matrix. And what we've seen over the last 200-300 years, at least in North America, is this fragmentation of the landscape. It really began through timbering and forestry practices, and it's increased through agriculture and urbanization and transportation systems, where we've continued to fragment the natural landscape. In the East, that's been mostly forested land. In the Midwest, it's been prairie. And then in the Western United States, it's more the arid regions that make up most of our landscape. And so we are seeing a fragmentation of this across the United States, which is leading to a great impact in biodiversity. And we can think about this on different scales. We can think about this from a regional scale, and those species that are wide ranging, say bear or wolves or migratory birds, where they need a large landscape, they need a region to survive, all the way down to the local scale, right? And that could be a plot of land no bigger than a couple square feet to an acre or two. And every one of these scales has specific ways and functions in terms of biodiversity. So we need to be thinking about biodiversity in terms of scale, and we need to be thinking about the different characteristics associated with that. And this is just another way of illustrating that fact. When we think about the spatial scale, a large scale, we can see the different examples of typical organisms and ecological processes that operate on a regional scale versus the types of organisms and ecological processes that happen on a very site-specific scale. So when we think about farming and we think about ranching, we can think about not only how our farm or ranch is nested within this larger regional scale, but then what's actually happening on the farm or ranch that's either contributing to those nested scales or is being impacted because of things happening outside of the farm. The other thing that we've seen across the landscape that has impacted biodiversity is this idea of trophic cascades, or the ecology of fear. We've extirpated or removed most of the top predators, at least in North America, on the landscape, whether we've severely reduced the range and habitat of bear, grizzly bear, cougars, mountain lions, wolves. And as a result, we've seen this cascade, or what scientists call a trophic cascade, where we're beginning to lose components of the landscape. So if we lose, say, cougars or mountain lions from the landscape, then our elk or deer or other ungulates increase in population, and as a result, they overgraze. And as a result of that, we begin to lose a lot of the understory of our forest. We might get erosion along stream banks, and because of that, that begins to affect the aquatic systems, and it's just, again, this cascade that happens. Farming and ranching have a role to play in this in terms of thinking about, and we'll get into this in a minute, about how could we design farms and ranches to be predator friendly? How can we work in a way to begin restoring some of these components, these biodiversity or species components of the landscape that we've lost? When we think about the landscape, we think about these patches that I mentioned before. We think about clusters of patches, and we think about this mosaic of patches. And in fact, scientists have come up with ways to look at biodiversity in terms of these patches on the landscape. The larger the patch, the better, the more biodiverse we have. The smaller the patch, the worse. And in fact, this little diagram on the right begins to show how we can begin designing landscapes in a way to increase biodiversity and decrease the impact on losing species. And this plays right into how we design farms and how we design ranches. Can we do it in a way that actually works with nesting these farmlands and pastures and livestock area within a greater mosaic where we have some of the natural features of the landscape where wild species can move throughout the landscape without being impacted. So some biodiversity best practices when it comes to thinking about the matrix. One is, each farm is dependent on a certain ecosystem type. So it's really important to understand what that is. The regional context and connections outside of the farm are really important. So how can the farm actually reinforce those regional contexts and connections? The distance between patches of semi-natural habitats is really important. So when we think about industrial farming, or we think about, tens or hundreds of acres of cleared land, can that be done in such a way, or can it be redone in such a way where we begin to introduce these ideas of semi-natural habitats? Widths of corridors and sizes of patches matter. The structural complexity of vegetation within these areas matters, and the diversity of these different matrix matter across the landscape. And so it's really important that we think about all this, not just from a farm level, but from what I like to call a 30,000 or 40,000 foot level, and look at it from a regional perspective. And then keystone species and carnivores do matter. They're extremely important for biodiversity. And if we can come up with ways to farm and ranch where we're friendly to carnivores and friendly to keystone species, that will only increase the opportunities to enhance and protect biodiversity. So we also know in farming that below ground is probably the most important aspect of farming, right? What happens in the soil. And we know the soil has a direct connection to the climate, and a direct connection to our food, a direct connection to our water, and obviously a direct connection to biodiversity. Healthy soil means healthy biodiversity. And in fact, when we think about the landscape in North America, and we think about bison back in the day, all the different aspects of bison on the landscape and what they did to change and sort of manage the landscape in terms of how they moved across the landscape, how they fed, where they defecated, how they grubbed for water and other things. And so I think it's really important when we think about livestock too, how can we replicate some of these actions? And I know there's been a lot of research over the past decades on thinking about holistic management for livestock, and how to move livestock around, how to do intensive sort of grazing, and then allowing that land to lay fallow for a while so it can recuperate, but how to mimic some of these sort of features on the landscape and these processes, these ecosystem processes that sort of our natural flora or our natural fauna created. So some biodiversity best practices here are reduced or zero tillage. That will certainly help from a soil. We know that the more soil is broken up, the more impact we have on the biological component of soils. So if we can get away with no tillage, that would be the best thing. Cover crops, bare soil is always prone to again, impacts from weather patterns and intensive rainfalls. And so covering our soil at all times is extremely important from a biodiversity standpoint. Using biologically active soil amendments, mixed crop and livestock systems, water filtration, infiltration, and conservation are extremely important on our landscape. How do we get that water to stay on the land, to infiltrate, and to make sure we protect our groundwater sources and our receiving water sources? That's extremely important from a biodiversity perspective. The third aspect that I like to think of in terms of biodiversity is what I call runoff. And what I mean by that is that, you know, there's a lot of things that run off our farms. And we can think about that all the way from species and invasive species to our nutrients like nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, and how species move across the landscape as well. We do know when we think about our planetary systems right now, many scientists are saying that our nitrogen cycle is way out of sync with the resources we have on this planet. And so we need to be thinking about how we can do a better job of managing our nitrogen cycle. Phosphorus cycle is not quite in that range yet, but we are seeing impacts to some of our major bodies, water bodies across the United States, whether that's the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay, San Francisco Bay, or others where phosphorus is becoming a huge issue. And so farms and agriculture have a big, I think, responsibility for managing the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles within their landscape. And we see the over-nutrification of a lot of our water bodies, right? We're doing some work right now up in what was formerly the Black Swamp area of northwestern Ohio and northeastern Indiana, in that area, where we're looking at ways of reconfiguring the land, reconfiguring some of these drainage systems, and working with farmers on how to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus on the landscape. But from a biodiversity standpoint, this has a huge impact on our aquatic systems. We're seeing these dead zones begin to happen in Lake Erie and the Mississippi, Gulf of Mexico from the Mississippi watershed. And so if we can do a better job of managing the nutrient cycle on our farms and ranches, then we'll begin to also have a positive impact on many of our aquatic systems as well. And how we manage the sort of waste that comes off of farms and livestock areas is really important. A couple of examples are, how do we manage our aquatic stream systems that run through many of our farms and ranches in a way that is beneficial for those aquatic systems. For instance, you know, providing riparian buffers and fencing to keep animals and livestock out of these systems, or to provide some type of nutrient management system on the farm where we're collecting those nutrients and processing them, instead of letting them drift back into the soil and into our drainage systems and ultimately into these receiving waters. Pesticides are another big issue that we deal with in farming. And in fact, that's one of the big reasons why we believe we're seeing a decrease in a lot of our invertebrates or insects, both terrestrial and aquatic. If we look at this slide here, it's a bit complicated, but it shows the taxonomic group at the top. It shows what kinds of exposures these taxonomic groups receive, either through plants, air, soil, or water. And then what are the ecotoxicological effects of those species as well from these different pesticides. And so how we regulate pesticides, how we minimize pesticides on the landscape and in farming will be key to restoring a lot of biodiversity in farming. In fact, this was really interesting. They looked at cowpats in pastures in the Netherlands and looked at the different types of flies and beetles that were associated with these. And on conventional, you know, they looked at conventional farms, they looked at organic farms, and they looked at conservation areas. And we can see that in what's considered conservation farming, that we had a much greater diversity of these flies and beetles on these cowpats than we did in conventional farms. And it just goes to show that when we begin to eliminate some of the pesticides and other over nutrification of our farm fields, then we begin to automatically increase biodiversity. So some other biodiversity best practices that we may think of as buffer strips that not only provide water filtration, buffering from runoff, but also serve as some of those corridors that we talked about from a landscape ecology perspective. How can we increase the genetic diversity in both our plant and animal stock, which will increase the resistance to pests and diseases, which will hopefully decrease the use of pesticides and other inorganic substances. Can we use organic fertilizers? Can we use organic or at a minimum integrated pest management systems to reduce a lot of our pesticides? How can we use natural wetland treatment systems as a way to begin treating a lot of the waste that comes off our farms, but does it in a biologically rich and biodiverse way? So we're actually providing biodiversity in the way we're filtering out water and waste systems. And then what I like to call thinking about one water. We're not only thinking about rainfall, we're thinking about how that rain interacts with the soil, how it infiltrates into the groundwater, how it runs off the soil into our aquatic systems, our streams and our lakes and our ponds, and how does it infiltrate down into the ground and into our groundwater. If we think about that whole cycle there, then we begin to think about ways of increasing conservation of water, increasing the use of filtration systems, which will in fact increase biodiversity on the landscape as well. So restoring the future, what do I mean by that in terms of agriculture? Well, a couple of things. One is we come back to Edward O. Wilson again, and he's proposed this idea that we need almost half of the earth set aside to protect biodiversity. And if we're ever going to achieve that, then agriculture has to be a key component of how we achieve that. May not be the reduction of the amount of farmland we need, but we need to look at how we design farmland in such a way to fit within the context of this landscape, this matrix that actually, again, enhances and protects biodiversity. And then what we do on the farm matters as well. And if we do that from an agricultural standpoint, then I think we can make a great strides in getting to this half Earth idea. We've also began looking at how species move across the landscape, right? On a continental scale. And in fact, if we look at the United States, we've begun to model how species move across the landscape. In this case, we're looking at large mammals and predators and how they move across the landscape. But imagine if we could design farms and design ranches in such a way where we actually facilitate this movement through and around our agricultural areas, where the agricultural areas are not only there growing food for us, but they're also enhancing sort of the idea of increasing wild animals and the movement of species across the landscape. And in fact, even if we take this down to a bit of a smaller scale, there's efforts underway like the Eastern Wildway, where we can create these corridors for these species to move throughout. And then actually there's many states out there right now that have what they call these green prints or green infrastructure or their own wildway prints of how they could begin to stitch back together that fragmented landscape to increase biodiversity. And again, how agriculture needs to play such a critical role in facilitating and making this all happen. So when we think about restoring the future, I want you to think about two things. I want you to think about what's happening on the farmland, but we also need to think about what's happening surrounding the farmland. Again, how can we design farmland in such a way that it's sensitive to the context that it sits in? We need to think about patches and corridors of that native landscape, and we need to think about how the farm itself is sort of that matrix that fits in with those patches and corridors, and how all of that can be used to reinforce connections for biodiversity, for movement of species, both flora and fauna, native flora and fauna across the landscape. We need to think about the whole web of life that interacts with our farms, that surrounds our farms, and is part of what farming is all about. And I think it's probably going to take a combination of all these things based on the context and based on what's right and based on the need to feed not only, you know, the United States, but the world. So what we think about is we need to think about both the farmland and what we're doing on the farmland and how the farmland is situated within our surrounding. Then we provide all types of opportunities and synergies for increasing biodiversity, not only in the US, but around the world. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I look forward to hearing from all of you in terms of questions or dialogue.